Today we'll be looking at 8-mark discuss questions. We're looking at the kind of common pitfalls that candidates fall into, why they don't necessarily achieve 4 marks, and how we can get ourselves into that top band. So first of all, here's a question type that's presented to you. So generally with discuss questions, you'll have a context. They do sometimes try and trick you a little bit by not having a context, but still using the command word discuss. So make sure you're careful to look at the command word when you're answering one of these 8-mark questions or the longer ones that come in paper 2 or 3. So I can't stress this enough. The first thing you should do in discuss or even those explain questions is make sure you go through and pick out the key parts of the context that you're going to use in your answer. So first of all, identify the model or theory that they want you to apply. And we can see that the model or theory they want us to apply is down here. It's the multi-store model. Then we want to look at what in the context that they've given us gives us hints towards the multi-store model. So the fact that he's in his early 70s and lived alone with since his wife has died 2 years ago, knowing that this is about memory, his age is going to be of importance, so we can highlight that bit. He's been having problems remembering if he's taken his medication, so we can highlight that. He's repeatedly asking people what day it is and remembers the answers only briefly. I mean, that's flagging short-term memory to us straight away. He recognises his children but forgets that he has a new grandson, so that's telling us something about making new long-term memories. And then again, they've referred to the multi-store memory model. So now we've highlighted the key bits, it's time to move on to structuring our answer. So those of you who are accessing this remotely, I want you to have a think before you go to the next slide about how we should structure the answer. And it's important that you recognise whether you know how to do it first, or if I'm just going to be telling you how to do it in this presentation. Because if it's the latter, then you really need to kind of concentrate on this and maybe do some more practice questions. So it's kind of cemented in your head, this is how I structure 8-mark discuss. So here's my example structure. For 8-mark discuss questions, I would suggest using a merged format as opposed to the chunked format we use in evaluate questions. The reason being that if you spend a paragraph just doing the AO1s of the multi-store model, what you're going to end up doing is repeating yourself quite a lot when you go on to the AO2s and explaining how they work in Mr. Williams. You don't want that. You want to kind of get the work done as quickly as you can so you can move on to the next question. The biggest barrier to achieving a high grade in psychology is running out of time. So if we can get our answer down more quickly, that's all to the good. So as you can see, you do an AO1 describe part of the multi-store model, explaining what that looks like in Mr. Williams. Then your next paragraph will be more of the multi-store model, explain what that looks like in Mr. Williams. And your third paragraph must be an alternative. In every discuss question, you have to present an alternative explanation. Sometimes they will give you a hint in the context of the alternative they're looking for. There wasn't much of a hint in this one, but given the fact that short-term memory seems to be the focus, I picked working memory model here. I mean, you could also use schema theory if you wanted to, or Turing's reconstructive memory. It might be that Mr. Williams is losing cues for retrieval, for example. It's entirely down to you, but for me personally, I think working memory model works best in this case. Okay, so you need to give yourself exactly 12 minutes to have a go at this question. Remember, it's 1.5 minutes per mark, and this is an 8-mark question. If you're really stretching yourself, maybe cut it down a little to 10. Definitely don't go over 12 minutes. It's going to give you unrealistic expectations of what you can actually achieve in the exam. So stick on this slide, give yourself 12 minutes, set a timer. As soon as the timer's up, you need to stop, and that's going to give you an accurate reflection of where you are. If you're finding that you're running out of time, look carefully at your AO1s and AO2s. Have you been as succinct as you could have been? Have you maybe belaboured the point too much? Have you repeated yourself? Neither of those things are going to get you any extra marks. You know, we don't want to ramble here. Say what you mean to say and then be done. So the next 2 slides are the mark scheme with the AO1s and the AO2s on. Frankly, they're a bit rubbish, but it gives you some idea of the indicative content that's expected in your AO1s and your AO2s, and that kind of gives you some kind of steer as to what you should have included. Very obvious where you need to include the multi-store memory model. You talk about 3 different stores, you need to talk about their capacity, duration, type of encoding, all those kinds of things, how retrieval occurs, things like maintenance, rehearsal, decay, forgetting, all of those kinds of things should be in your AO1 paragraph. But again, you don't have an infinite amount of time. So be selective and make sure you explain things as succinctly as possible. I can't emphasize enough how important that is. So this is the AO2 bits, and this is really misleading because there's no indication here that you need to give another viewpoint or another explanation for what's happening in Mr. Williams' memory. That means that if you were to do everything that was in the AO1s and everything that was in the AO2s, it's very likely you're only going to score 4 marks, and I'll show you why on the next bit. So here are the bandings for discuss questions. Always identical on every single discuss question. So this is where it clearly indicates why you need to talk about other models and why you're not going to get away with just talking about the multi-store model. So if you look at the difference between band 2 and band 3, so in band 2 we've got this development is partially developed and imbalanced and superficially associated and that kind of thing. But in band 3 you've got this mention of competing arguments. If you don't have those competing arguments, you cannot score in band 3. So you've got to make sure you include another explanation, another theory, another model in these kinds of questions. So you've got to have that grasp of competing arguments. Generally, most people, if they do a relatively thorough job, they've got those competing arguments in, they're going to be sitting in band 3. And whether they score 5 or 6 marks depends on the quality of their AO1s and their AO2s. To get into band 4, we've got to look at what's different about the level descriptor there. So first of all, they've added this word thorough. To demonstrate thorough knowledge, the marker must believe that there is absolutely nothing about the multi-store model you don't. That doesn't mean you have to write everything there is to write about the multi-store model. It just means that it's very clear from what you've written that there are oceans of knowledge that you have about the multi-store memory model, and you provided a small sample. That means that your AO1s must cover as many aspects as possible. You've got to drill down into depth on some parts of it. It's got to be clear to the marker that this person knows the multi-store model inside out. Then, as we kind of look down, that's the AO1 bit. The AO2 bit, you can see here we've got this logical chains of reasoning. So this is why we merge our AO1s and AO2s, because we're clearly working through the multi-store model step by step in a logical and reasoned way. That kind of makes it easy for us. Some candidates find it useful to do a skeleton plan when they have this kind of essay. Just 5 or 6 bullet points at the top of what's going to go in each paragraph. That can be very useful. Once you start writing, it's easy to get lost in what you're saying and end up repeating yourself, and then suddenly you're slipping down the bandings because you're not being logical. Then that thorough awareness of competing arguments. This is where you're going to bring to bear your working memory model. You can demonstrate good knowledge of the working memory model. Remember, the question's not about the working memory model, so you don't have to go into as much detail about what it says as you do for the multi-store. But you have to explain it in sufficient detail for your application to be useful. So the aspect of the working memory model that you're going to talk about needs to be applicable to Mr. Williams. So once you've written your answer and kind of listened to my explanations of the mark scheme, you should be able to give yourself a mark out of 8. My personal suggestion is that you do this in tandem with somebody else and you mark theirs and they mark yours, because it's very easy to misjudge our own work because we know what we mean. So if there's something with the clarity of your writing that's preventing you getting higher marks, you probably won't recognise that, whereas one of your peers might. So again, I strongly recommend you pair up for this kind of activity. If you and your partner have marked it and you're still not quite sure where it should fall on the mark scheme, you're more than welcome to drop in and see me during our study support sessions on a Thursday, and I'll have a go at marking it for you. Any questions or anything about this presentation, any difficulties in answering these kinds of questions, you're welcome to ping me a message on Teams, and I'll try and get back to you. But generally the best suggestion I can give you is drop in person, and then we're much more likely to have a fruitful discussion. So thank you for watching. I hope it's been useful, and I will see you all in college.